If I could pass on my welcome and good morning to everybody as well. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, our first speaker, who'll be presenting two papers, so that's going to give us lots of value. Garrick Small is a property economist with several decades of experience as an academic and consultant property economist. He has taught at the University of Technology in Sydney, the University of New South Wales, the University of Western Sydney and the University of the South Pacific, which is based in Fiji. Currently he serves as an Associate Professor at Central Queensland University, main campus at Rockhampton. Garrick completed his PhD at UTS on the application of the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle to the problem of property and its significance to modern economics. He's continued to solve contemporary problems in property economics using the classical realism of St. Thomas and Aristotle. He's published and spoken widely on Catholic social thought, not only in Australia, but in Europe and in the United States. He's presented papers at previous Chesterton conferences at Campion in 2011 and 2015, and it's a great pleasure to welcome him back today. He will in fact be speaking twice at this conference, for which we are most grateful. His first paper is on the marketplace and the family. Please welcome Garrick Small.
Thank you very much, Gary. By the end of this talk, some of you will probably think that the introduction was for somebody else. What I want to cover this morning is economics and the family in the thought of G.K. Chesterton, and really connect those ideas, the importance of the family, to economics. And I thank Carl very much because he gave an illustration of something that I find is very significant. I think the best economists are not economists at all. I'm not sure exactly of Carl's first degree, but he certainly speaks about economics better than an awful lot of economics professors that I've heard. Thank you, Carl. And I think Chesterton is in the same boat. We'll get more onto that later on. I would say that Chesterton had a profound understanding of economics, but he did not write economics like an economist. His method was rather that of a poet, and his focus was not on the technicalities of the science, but rather on its foundational principles. He ignored Homo economicus, and, like Aristotle, he recognised that economics was about the interactions of people. And those interactions are moral, and their resolution was available to common sense. Hilaire Belloc wrote on the technical issues in works such as The Restoration of Property, but even when Chesterton wrote a book with a title that went to the heart of the economic problem, The Utopia of the Usurious, one finds far more common sense observations about people than about the ponderous proofs of the underlying morals behind economics. Chesterton's most insightful work on economics are found in the story of Hudge and Gudge. Like many of Chesterton's greatest insights, it is not a long or complex argument, but a simple allegory in almost too few words. Hudge represents big government. Gudge represents big business. They are both the enemies of Jones, who just wants to raise a family and be a hero to his grandchildren. Hudge wants to give Jones a government flat, and Gudge wants to rent him the answer to all his dreams. But Jones just wants to own his own house and for it to be his home and his castle. Pope Pius XI, 1931, described the economics of Hudge and Gudge in these terms. Accordingly, twin rocks of shipwreck must be carefully avoided, for as one is wrecked upon or comes close to, what is known as individualism by denying or minimising the social and public character of the right of private property. So, by rejecting or minimising the private and individual character of this same right, one invariably runs into collectivism, or at least closely approaches its tenets. The Pope was not a poet, but rather a father, wanting to keep his children out of hell. Not only did he care for the families of the Joneses, but also for the souls of the Gudges and the Hudges, because he saw their possibly well-meaning attempts at solving the economic riddle as dangers to their immortal souls, which he immediately described in these terms. Unless this is kept in mind, one is swept from his course by the shoals of that moral, juridical and social modernism which we denounced in the encyclical issued at the beginning of our pontificate, and in particular, let those realise this who, in their desire for innovation, do not scruple to reproach the Church with infamous calumnies, as if she had allowed to creep into the teachings of her theologians a pagan concept of ownership, which must be completely replaced by another that they, with amazing ignorance, call Christian. These are strong words, but confusing. Hudge and Gudge, individualism and collectivism, capitalism and communism, all are being denounced as aspects of that synthesis of all heresies that is the plague of the Church in our time, and for that matter, humanity. Chesterton saw it clearly. So did Pope Pius XI. But it is hardly understood at all at our part of history. Let us look a little deeper. Chesterton saw them as enemies of the family, because that is what Jones represents. Jones is a man who seeks the freedom to raise his family and to be a grandfather. These goals can only mean the family as God intends it to be. Fecund, faithful, motivated by love, and the profound image of the Most Blessed Trinity. That is the model of all social relations. The notion of family sounds quaint today and is rapidly being replaced by the family of self-interest. It was warned about by Carl Zimmermann in 1947 in his work Family and Civilization, when Zimmermann prophesied that a time would come when individuals would only stay with their families for as long as was biologically necessary. Zimmermann was predicting the nuclear family and the social relations within what is misleadingly called gay marriage. For that matter, although he was not a Catholic, he was also predicting the 1983 Code of Canon Law, which introduced the massive personalist loophole of psychological needs into the stability of family, which provided an escape route via the annulment process that has sent Catholic divorce and remarriage rates now equalling those of the rest of the community. E. Michael Jones has insightfully concluded that in our world today, all sexual relations are modelled on gay sex and not on natural fecund sex, which is to say, the relations of taking and not giving. Through the contraceptive mentality, this gives us the temporary family Zimmermann warned about, a family of taking, not giving. There are also two economies, an economy or an economics of taking and an economics of giving. One produces growth and prosperity, the other produces exploitation and decay. Zimmermann's book is also curious because his work on the family and its foundational importance on the trajectory of civilization was also a book on property rights, which is what I took interest in it for first. He showed how changes in property rights could be mapped historically as one of the early indicators of the direction of entire civilizations. Property rights for Zimmerman closely followed attitudes to family, and family relations writ large are the personal relationships that build civilizations or destroy it. Chesterton saw this, just as the church had seen it from the beginning. Chesterton's solution to the problem of property was widely distributed private property. This gave his approach the unwieldy title of distributism. It is not the only solution to property, but it is one of them. It is neither individualism nor collectivism. It is not modern, nor is it modernist. It is common sense. But common sense is often bullied out of our is often dulled by our fallen nature with its predisposition to sin. For Chesterton, the economic ideal regarding property was for every man to have his own house and his own place of work. He recognised that the concentration of property was an evil thing, just as the church has always taught that it was an evil thing. St. Thomas Aquinas had perfected Aristotle's dual theory of property 7 centuries before Chesterton applied it to hudge and gudge. St. Thomas, writing as he was 2 centuries before the nascent capitalism of the 15th century, erupting into the Protestant capitalism of the 16th, understood that property was naturally common, but due to the necessities of fallen human nature, required a dimension of private ownership. The twin aspects of property, private ownership with common use, map into the twin shipwrecks of faith, represented by the individualism and collectivism, both denounced as modernist evils by Pope Pius XI. The Catholic understanding of property is neither the radical private property of the individualist, nor the radical common use of the collectivist. We know them more simply as the capitalist and the communist theories of property and economics. The Catholic Church has always recognised conditional private property, whereas capitalism takes property to the extreme of absolute private property. It is no surprise that the 19th century rebellion against this dysfunctional extreme private property was its extreme rejection, and Proudhon's socialist rally cry, "Property is theft." Extreme private property, especially as it concentrates, is theft. But conditional private property is well conformed to the human condition, as St. Thomas Aquinas had carefully pointed out. Property was one of the 4 economic principles enunciated by the angelic doctor, along with right use of property. St. Thomas described the right use of money, the right use of trade, and our right use of our excess wealth as important moral principles for the organisation of social relations in the economic realm. Each of them provided the economic actor with the free opportunity to practice virtue, or to be just or unjust. Aristotle had described the possibilities as natural or unnatural. Despite being a pagan, Aristotle recognised that our true nature is to act justly, though we are also attracted to unnatural acts, which need to be discouraged in order to be civilised. Both Aristotle and St. Thomas recognised that the starkest instance of injustice in the economic realm was in the case of the money loan, where any pure profit demanded by the lender was theft. That species of theft has its own name, usury. In St. Thomas's era, usury was understood as grievously sinful. Dante put usurers into the deepest pits of hell, along with sodomites. Aristotle argued that usury was immoral because money was sterile, which E. Michael Jones saw as the link between usurers and sodomites, and developed Dante's vision of hell to suggest why our part of history likes both usury and sodomy as superseded moral values. The modern era can be viewed as a creeping half-millennial battle to baptise usury. Max Weber saw the economic system it spawned as a creature of the Reformation, whose principal achievement was the subjectivisation of all morals. Its success caused Pope Leo XIII to lament that the modern world was awash with rapacious usury. The early 20th century Jesuit economist Heinrich Pesch defined capitalism as state-sponsored usury. But in the ascendancy of finance that peaked in the 1980s, it was proclaimed instead that greed is good, which is only really a refinement of Adam Smith's 18th century inverted moral dictum supporting capitalism, that self-interest is the master good that coordinates and perfects economic relations of nations, his invisible hand metaphor. Self-interest is only really a politer term for greed. Smith was the 18th century Scottish professor of moral philosophy, who was often dubbed as the father of modern economics. His dictum is really a moral inversion of greed from being a vice into being the key to social harmony. Chesterton was not convinced by Smith, though Karl Marx was. Chesterton correctly noted that communism was the fruit of capitalism. In this he is joined by many others, not the least the contemporary Catholic philosopher Peter Kreeft. Both communism and capitalism are ultimately centralist. Both are based on a faulty concept of freedom. The perversion of freedom has perhaps been the most sinister achievement of the modern era. Freedom, or liberty, has become the fundamental moral right of the West and its ultimate moral objective. It may be a right, but the conception of that right is faulty. Freedom in the context is the context for the unfettered exercise of free will. And free will is the raw material, the matter, the material cause, if you like, of moral action. Without freedom, no moral act is possible. But this does not mean that freedom is a moral end. Virtuous action is the exercise of the free will to choose the good. Exterior freedom facilitates virtuous action. Training in virtue does not have its end in freedom, but in the habit of the intellect to identify the good and of the will to choose it. Modernity has been partly about the truncation of morals to the point that the greatest good, the summum bonum of moral action, is merely the removal of all restraint. It is common to hear in this part of history freedom spoken about as though it was the end point of moral action. It is not. Where freedom becomes the summum bonum, all moral discourse ends, and licence is placed on equal footing with virtue. This is why the Church spoke of liberalism as an evil in the 19th century, and by that word referred to capitalism, which it condemned. It was referring to the way that the intellectual enemies of the Church in the 18th century had elevated freedom to a dysfunctional extreme. Even more complex was the way that 18th century liberalism expressed itself in two polar opposite manners. In England, liberalism was associated with capitalism and the Conservatives. Across the Channel in France, liberalism was associated with the Communes and the Revolution and the left. It was the French understanding of liberalism that Benjamin Franklin took back to North America. It meant that the American War of Independence was actually fought between two opposing armies who shared the same battle cry: liberty. It could well have been Gudge fighting for liberation from the liberality of Hudge. The Americans framed it as the little people liberating themselves from the predatorial practices that had built the British Empire. The left seeking liberation from the right. In the American case, that liberation had merit because the British right had exceeded its moral mandate. just as it had done over all its empire, including within our own shores. Its own shores, sorry. In Britain, that is, England. The excess of British liberalism forced indentured Indian labour into working misery in various colonial outposts. It sold opium into China and sent destitute Englishmen into prisons the size of countries and given names like New South Wales. A characteristic of British liberalism is the concentration of property. It is centralist, though not centralist in the socialist sense of centralising economic power into the hands of the government, but in the individualist sense of centralising it into the hands of a few individuals who had none of the civic obligations of the state. Chesterton recognised that centralism of any stripe was antisocial and therefore, past a point, immoral. His solution was anti-centralist, widely distributed private property. Chesterton understood that keeping property distributed would require a moral effort. It could not be left to the coercion of the government, or it would become socialist. It could not be left to the mechanics of greed, as Smith taught, because greed is antisocial and turns every man into a predator in competition where few survive and most are consumed. Chesterton's economics is taught subtly. His work, The Utopia of the Usurers, is not an outline of a theory or a program, the way that Belloc's restoration of property is. It is rather an appeal to our higher faculties, a plea to consider the common sense of self-restraint in the marketplace. It is an appeal to engage in the economy in a way that does more than seek the slickest bargain or the fattest profit. It is to freely choose to act in a civilised manner, which is a moral manner and a godly manner. In this, Chesterton combined the inner lessons within all of St Thomas's economic morals. While usury may be narrowly the theft involved in the exploitation of a money loan, the theft through an unjust price in the marketplace has much in common. It is also comparable to the theft of that common use in property that the owner must always afford to the community, whether they be tenants, customers, or employees. In Caritas in Veritate, Pope Benedict XVI threw attention on the way these evils could only be avoided by recognising that both the market and politics need individuals who are open to reciprocal gift. In this, the Pope was implicitly proposing the solution to the riddle of the twin rocks of shipwreck of his predecessor. It could not be the false liberality of the left or the right, but the true freedom that comes from self-restraint that is traditionally taught within the family. Lester K. Little is amongst those who have noted the difference between the contract economy and the gift economy. The contract economy is the economy of self-interest, expressed either as communism or capitalism. The gift economy is the economy of the family. In the functional family, the economic exchanges are all gifts. A mother does not charge her son for breakfast, though he does have to do his chores. Although the father's role is to teach and direct the coordinated life of the family, his goal is not its subjection, but its growth into adult responsibility, especially for his children, to the point where they can adopt the selflessness of their parents freely. A father's role is to love his wife and his children, just as it is the wife's role to supply her children with the first and most profound example of the orderly obedience and submission that we all eventually owe to God, the Father himself. Both are gifts, reciprocal gifts, between spouses, and simultaneously gifts that proceed to the children. St Bonaventure articulated the triune gifts of love that comprise the most holy Trinity. And these flow down into the family which is the most perfect image on earth of the archetype for all social relationship. Pope Benedict's fondness for St. Bonaventure is evident in his Economics. It is an education in virtue, which is always self-restraint for the good. This is true freedom. It points in one direction. In the family, it directs children to understand how to be parents in their turn, where they must exercise virtue of their own volition. The school of the family is meant to teach these lessons to all of society as well, within the arena that comprise civilization. It should be no surprise that there are lessons for economics as well, which is why Aristotle gave the title to the science, economia, which in the classical Greek is a word that derives from household management, the management of the family. The very term for the science has to do with the family. Every social act is potentially an act of love. Chesterton understood this, and it is a substrate on which all of his writing was built. It is the example of the family when the family is acting as an example of God himself. It uses freedom, but only as the opportunity to choose the good, which is what every father hopes to see in his children. It is linked to why the great social encyclicals all had the same form. They all began with a denunciation of socialism, which was promptly followed by a stronger and a longer denunciation of capitalism, and ended with the recognition that only through evangelization could the economic problem be solved. This is an odd formula for admonitions on economics. It showed that it is not by policies or institutions that the economic problem is resolved, but by submission to the will of God and the practice of relations that are native to the family. It should be no wonder that the so-called modern science of economics tries to distance itself from morals, or that socialism is ultimately always in opposition to Christianity, and usually the very idea of morals. The language of socialism tends to be the language of rights. Oddly, they never use the true notion of rights, which always originate in God, but something that has more in common with guns and war and rebellion. A genuine right is a power or faculty given by God that obligates everyone else to respect its owner. We have a right to life, and no matter how effective the rebellion, we will never have a right to kill the innocent. From our right to life comes the right to the product that comes from the application of some of that life, which may have some value for someone else. If I spend a day digging a hole, that's a day of my life spent digging the hole. It's mine. St. Thomas Aquinas recognised that fallen human nature makes the convention of private property in other things a practical necessity, but it never negates the general right of all men to some level of use of those things that come directly from God's creation. St. Thomas explained why our sinful nature made it necessary for that practical necessity to be upheld by God as a right. However, that contingent right of private property can never be absolute. It is only ever conventional, or not natural. In a functional family, the parents may own the home, but the children use it as a right. The right of the parents to private property in their home is a convention set by the society to which they belong. The right of the children to use their house is a natural right that they enjoy by being a part of the family and a part of humanity. Understanding rights is the key to understanding what lies at the back of Chesterton's economic thought, even though he never actually used those terms. certainly in the formal way that St Thomas would. He realised that the concentration of economic power in any form was a violation of the rights of those without it. In the case of real property, real estate, land, when a man owns one house, he owns what he needs to shelter his family. He has a right to that as much as his children have a right to it. When a man owns two houses and charges high rents on the one that he does not live in, then he is denying his neighbour's right to shelter and turning it into a weapon of exploitation. The same is true of places of work. Likewise, a man has a right to a living wage, but he does not have the right to the wages of a king, unless he's a king. Employers often see themselves as kings and extort for themselves the wages of a king by paying their employees the wages of a slave. They're not kings, but tyrants, and in more sober times could expect a lecture from a priest who would warn them, as an act of love, that tyrants go to hell. Customers have rights to fair prices, and suppliers have a right to fair payment for the raw materials they supply to manufacturers. Lenders have no right to pure interest from a money loan, even though they may be compensated for losses due to the loan, such as the effects of inflation. It is not the purpose of this paper to evaluate the implications of this set of rights, but merely to observe that they do exist, and exist objectively for that matter, and that there are methods for their evaluation. More importantly is the fact that they are moral obligations, and that the economically strong owe to the economically weak. Being moral obligations, they may be freely accepted as an implicit act of love, or they may be sinfully rejected. Somehow the common man understands these things, and Chesterton insightfully presented to the common man what he really knew already. Chesterton went further than this. He made some suggestions for practical methods of protecting people from the human frailty of the inclination to exploit their neighbours. In the case of property, Chesterton's distributism would have public policy and private behaviour oriented towards distributed private property. This would mean that as many people as possible would own their own places of residence and their own places of work. This would ultimately be a moral or a social principle, and it would rely on the participation and the goodwill of the members of society. In our practical, fallen world, often we need prompts to behave in moral ways. These include the code of law supported by the judicial system. Hilaire Belloc suggested legal mechanisms for discouraging people from owning more property than they needed for their family needs in restoration of property. A similar approach was taken for work. Chesterton's preference for small shops reflects this. Why does one need a multinational franchise to flip hamburger patties, when one man equipped with a fairly simple set of tools can do as well, or perhaps even better? Chesterton correctly identified the role of advertising in this unfortunate trend, and in his strategy for its undoing. In particular, is his recognition that the remedy should not primarily come from legislation or a revolution, but by popular decision. The best way to support small shops is to shop in them. Here, Chesterton is recommending something disarmingly simple, but impossibly difficult. Would you buy a hamburger from a little family-owned business when there is a McDonald's nearby? You probably would, because you're attending a Chesterton conference. But most may do otherwise. This is the essence of the remedy of Pope Leo XIII and Pope Pius XI, evangelisation. The solution is the freely willed decision to choose the difficult, though perhaps in reality the only more marginally expensive. The Catholic views every other person in the world as his neighbour and freely chooses to treat him as a brother. In the case of the economy, that free choosing stimulates the local economy and strengthens it. For us, it means choosing the Australian product and being willing to pay a little more than its Chinese counterpart. As I say, simple but impossibly difficult. That choosing may appear expensive, but is actually purchasing jobs and businesses for our children, who are our future, and the workforce that will fund our retirement. It is a good investment. Distributism has many critics. If one accepts their anthropology, then their criticisms are sound and explain why distributism is dead in the water today. The anthropology of the critics of distributism is pretty much the anthropology of the enemies of the Catholic Church. An anthropology is a theory of what it is to be human. Modernity believes that humans are self-interested individuals. Catholics believe that humans are made to know, love and serve God in this life in order to be with him forever in the next. Part of loving God is to love one's neighbour, which in the marketplace is to freely avoid concentrating property or using one's own economic power for exploitation. It is also to support public policies that promote the same. A nasty trend in the Catholic Church today is the adoption of the modern anthropology. The self-interested individual is focused on his own needs and wants God to accommodate them. For the modern progressive Catholic, this expresses itself as the rejection of the Church's timeless standard on marital relations, which has eaten into the Catholic family and the robustness of Catholic marriage. The individual's needs trumps the will of God and the good of society. The needs of the human person are now the object of religion in some quarters and are fast becoming the standard for marriage itself. For the modern conservative Catholic, this same aberrant anthropology expresses itself as a rejection of the Church's timeless standards on economic relations. In Chesterton's time, these twin rejections were more obvious. In the economic arena, they have been apparent since the Protestant revolt. Today, so-called gay marriage displays their triumph in the family as well. Distributism is but one of a number of economic systems that can affect a just and economically comfortable society. It was proposed as a system that would best suit contemporary modern Western culture, which it probably is. While there may be other systems that could also achieve this end, the one thing that we can know with certainty are those systems that do not. These are the twin rocks of shipwreck warned about by Pius XI, socialism and capitalism. Pius XI taught us that whenever we find a Catholic promoting either of these, we're actually in the sway of someone infected with that moral, social and juridical form of the aberration that Pius X described as the synthesis of all heresies. Chesterton leads us away from those rocks of shipwreck towards common sense in the marketplace. He leads us to treat our neighbours as part of our family. The family is God's image on earth and the example for all society. Between the worldly wisdom of Hudge and Gudge is the divine wisdom of the family of Jones. Chesterton has been aptly described as the apostle of common sense, but this has also made him the apostle of the family. His work conveys its joys and truths. The godly family is possible, but difficult and joyful. It requires self-discipline, but it brings great rewards. The godly economy is also possible, difficult and joyful. It too requires self-discipline, but it also brings great rewards. Thank you.